Welcome back to the Courtroom. I'm Terry Darrell Caldwell. For the past 7 episodes, we have examined the racial categories themselves: white, black, MENA, Asian, Native American, and other. We have shown that each is incoherent, arbitrary, and impossible to define with scientific or logical consistency. Now we turn from the boxes to the box maker. Who decided that these specific categories would appear on every federal form? By what authority? And why do the categories persist despite being debunked by science and rejected by millions of Americans? The prosecution would demonstrate that the racial classification system is not a creature of the Constitution, nor of any statute passed by Congress. It is an administrative construction built by career officials in the Office of Management and Budget using the authority of the Paperwork Reduction Act, a statute about paperwork. Let us begin. The Paperwork Reduction Act of 1974 was designed to reduce the burden of federal paperwork on the public. It created the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB and gave the director authority to coordinate federal statistical policies. This is the entire statutory authority for the federal racial classification system. Nothing in the Paperwork Reduction Act mentions race. Nothing mentions ethnicity. Nothing mentions the census. The act is about reducing bureaucratic paperwork. Yet, OMB used this authority to issue Statistical Policy Directive Number 15 in 1977. The document that defined the 4 original racial categories: white, black, Asian or Pacific Islander, American Indian or Alaska Native. In the separate Hispanic ethnicity question, a statute about paperwork became the legal foundation for classifying every American by race. The prosecution is not making this up. OMB officials have testified before Congress that no law mandates these specific categories. The categories are administrative standards, not statutory requirements. If the authority for racial classification is a statute about paperwork, then the entire system rests on a procedural accident. Before 1977, there was no uniform federal racial classification system. Different agencies used different categories for different purposes. The Census Bureau had its own set of race questions. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare used different categories for civil rights compliance. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission used its own categories for employer reports. A 1975 report found that 23 different race and ethnicity classification schemes were in use across the federal government. Agencies could not share data. The same person could be classified differently by different agencies. The problem was not scientific. The problem was administrative chaos. OMB convened an ad hoc committee on racial and ethnic definitions. The committee included representatives from the Census Bureau, HUE, EEOC, and the Department of Justice. It included no geneticists, no anthropologists, no evolutionary biologists. The committee did not solicit peer review from the scientific community. It was not asked to determine whether race was biologically real. It was asked to solve a data sharing problem. The classification system was designed by bureaucrats for bureaucrats. The 1977 directive is explicit about its own limitations. It states, these categories are social political constructs and should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature. The government knew from the very beginning that the categories were not real. They were a convenience, a temporary fix to an administrative problem. But temporary fixes have a way of becoming permanent. The categories were adopted by all federal agencies, then by state and local governments, then by private entities, hospitals, universities, corporations, as de facto standard. What began as a statistical convenience became common sense. The prosecution submits that the directive's disclaimer is the most important sentence in the entire classification system. The government admits the categories are not real, yet it continues to enforce them. That is not administration. That is institutionalized hypocrisy. The 1997 revision of Directive 15 made 3 substantive changes. First, allowing respondents to select more than one race, mark 1 or more. Second, splitting Asian or Pacific Islander into Asian and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. Third, retaining the Hispanic separate ethnicity question. What drove these changes? Not new scientific evidence, political pressure. The multiracial movement, led by organizations like Project Race and the Association of Multi-Ethnic Americans, lobbied for the ability to identify multiple ancestries. Native Hawaiian advocates demanded separation. The OMB resisted, then compromised. The MENA category was proposed again in 1997 and rejected again. The reasons were administrative. Adding a category would change the white population count, affecting redistricting and civil rights enforcement. The prosecution is not criticizing the multiracial or Native Hawaiian advocates. They were right to demand recognition. The point is that the categories change when political pressure mounts, not when science advances. If the system were based on biology, it would be stable. It is not stable. It is a negotiation. Now, the prosecution asks the jury to consider a critical fact. Congress has never defined what race means. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. It does not define race. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 uses the term. It does not define it. The Census Act authorizes Secretary of Commerce to conduct the census. It does not define race. Congress has had dozens of opportunities to define race. It has never done so. The Government Accountability Office has noted this ambiguity twice, in 1986 and 2004, and declined to recommend legislative action. The result is a definitional vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped OMB. The prosecution does not argue that Congress should define race. The prosecution argues that the absence of statutory definition proves that the categories are not rooted in law. They are rooted in administrative discretion. And what the administration creates, the administration can destroy. The Paperwork Reduction Act requires OMB to review and approve all federal information collections. That is the mechanism by which the racial categories are enforced. But the Act does not require OMB to use any particular categories. It gives OMB the authority to coordinate and make consistent federal statistical policies. A future OMB director could issue a new directive rescinding Directive 15. No congressional action required. No constitutional amendment needed. Just a new administrative rule. The prosecution is not saying this would be easy. The political opposition would be fierce, but the legal authority exists. The racial classification system persists because no president has chosen to end it. Now, the prosecution asks the jury to consider a simple question. If the federal racial classification system was created by an administrative directive issued under a statute about paperwork, if the categories have been revised based on political pressure, not science, if Congress has never defined what race means, and if a future OMB director could rescind the entire system with a new directive, then on what authority does the government ask any citizen to check any box? The answer is the same as we have seen throughout this series. No authority, only habit, only inertia, only the convenience of bureaucrats who do not want to redesign the forms. The prosecution does not ask you to be outraged. Outrage fades. The prosecution asks you to see the fragility of the system. It is not a natural law. It is a policy choice, and policies can be changed. In our next episode, we will examine the census as engine of reification, how the act of counting transforms administrative categories into social reality, and why the 2030 census is a critical crossroads. But for today, the prosecution rests on count 8. The racial classification system was built by bureaucrats using a statute about paperwork. It has no constitutional foundation. It has no statutory definition. It changes when political pressure mounts, and it can be dismantled by the same administrative authority that created it. If the boxes are not rooted in science, law, or logic, only in administrative convenience, then the state has no legitimate interest in demanding that you check them. Court will reconvene for episode 9, the census as engine of reification.